Hello, welcome to Faye's channel, where Faye is apparently just doing whatever she wants. I'm so sorry. I had a video planned for this week, but with work back in the schedule, and I know I was super happy about work, and I am still super happy about work, but with work back in the schedule, I'm very, very spread thin, let's just say that. I went for a run today after I came back from work. I have to take a shower right now, and don't get me wrong, there are videos that I can post in the, in the meantime while I'm doing my stuff. I also have 2 assignments to write before my exam in May. So I have a mini project to do, and I have an integrative essay to write. So I was thinking that I would do something that I've been planning to do for a little while now, since I essentially got the green light. I have 2 stories, and you may have been hearing this for months now, maybe even years if you've stuck around long enough. But I have 2 stories that were published as audiobooks through Movellas and Sony Music, and my contract with them actually ran out recently. It ran out maybe like 2 weeks ago now, and I've asked some of my contacts at Movellas and at Sony Music if I could share the stories with you guys, and so far it seems as though everything is in order and everything is okay. It might get like copyright claimed, but I'm okay with that. I'm okay with the money going there. That's fine with me, because it doesn't really matter. It was something that I was incredibly proud of. It was something that was professionally, voice acted and stuff like that. Like, there was a lot of work that went into these pieces, and unfortunately there was mishandling in the way that these stories were shared, and I would like to do it my own way and put them on my channel so that they can live here forever. This will be a premiered video, so I would appreciate any super chats that you could give me, because like as not, I may probably not make any money on this if it does get claimed. If it doesn't, don't worry too much about that, and also don't worry too much about it in general, because I'm fine and I don't need the money, but I would appreciate any support that you guys could give. I am quite happy to just submit these right now. Like, I've already put all of the pieces together, and I hope you guys enjoy it, and I will hopefully see you in an actual video very soon, even though this is just a placeholder one. I'm also thinking about converting these into like self-published Amazon ebooks or Kindle books for like 99p or 99 cents, or whatever currency you work with. So if you're interested in that, let me know. I have the manuscript for one of the stories, because I've transferred manuscripts over like so many devices at this point. I definitely have one manuscript for one of the stories, but in terms of the other one, I'm not entirely sure, if I can be completely honest. So you might be getting 1 ebook instead of 2, but we'll see what happens. Thank you again. This is the last you'll be seeing of my lovely face today, so I will see you in the next video, and I really, really hope you enjoy the story. Bye.
One Man's Treasure by Rahman. Chapter 1. Paul Miller wasn't very good at believing in things. He didn't believe in anything he couldn't see or feel or smell. He didn't believe in global warming. He didn't believe in dinosaurs. He went to church often enough, but he didn't really believe in a god, any god, and he sure as hell didn't believe in curses. As an expression, of course. Paul Miller didn't believe in hell either. Ever since he was a little kid, Paul had been told that his family was cursed. The curse was said to take hold of every male member of his family at the age of 25, after which they would either die or go insane. Paul could bear witness that he had a few unfortunate uncles on his father's side. One had died in a fire that started as he was trying to grill cheese in a toaster. Another had been diagnosed with multiple personality disorder and died under tragic circumstances at an asylum. Despite these events, Paul had never taken such things seriously. He always said it was all malarkey brought on by moonshine and malice. Who in this day and age believed in curses after all? And how ironic was it that Paul himself started fearing for his life only a week before his 25th birthday? There was a stimulus, of course. A real stimulus. Not some hocus-pocus Holy Ghost or anything. One that he could see and feel and even smell at times. The reality of the matter kept him awake at night and distressed at all points in the day, restless to find answers, cures, anything. He even considered going to his local priest for answers. Then he decided against it, naturally. The priest didn't like him very much, and Paul thought the old man talked about the devil with regards to him enough already. Fear had driven him to travel to the place he never thought he'd have to go. The outside world, beyond his computer, his home, and the corner shop on his street. Paul parked his car and looked at the age-old public house. His mouth went dry as he took in a deep breath, gathering himself for possibly uncomfortable human interaction. This was stupid, he told himself. He didn't even know if the place allowed people an overnight stay. He probably should have checked that. Oh well, he was here now. He got out of the car, his shoes crunching on the gravel pavement up to the public house. There was a sign hanging on chains that read, "The Flying Shoe." A faded image of a Greek sandal with wings on its side stood above the peeling letters. Flying Shoe? What a stupid name. Shoes didn't fly. Paul put his hands in his pockets and examined the sign for a while, trying to form a logical explanation for such a ridiculous name. From a distance, you would think that Paul Miller was a normal person, but you would have to look beyond the black dress pants, the V-neck sweater and the white shirt he wore underneath, past the befuddled, bespectacled face and the podgy stomach he was beginning to form. Paul Miller was a brilliant man, or so he liked to think, but he hid it well behind his clothes, behind his reclusive behaviour and his complete distaste for human companionship. "Hello, sir," said a sweet, cheery voice. Paul looked away from the sign to the now open door of the Flying Shoe. Speak of the devil. Hello, Paul replied to the portly old lady by the door as if she was an alien from outer space. He even considered saying, "I come in peace," but that seemed a bit much even for him. "Would you like to come in, love?" she asked, smiling at him like she'd known him and had seen him for the first time after years and years of absence. Yeah, of course," Paul said. "I was just looking at your sign. It doesn't make much sense to me." "Well, it don't need to, dearie," the woman laughed. "Pubs up and down the town are called all sorts. One called the King's Arms, another called the Sty, and one is called the Morgue," she laughed heartily. "I think the Flying Shoe is the best chance you've got, dear." "Definitely better than the Morgue," Paul contemplated. He nodded. Having made his decision, he went back to his car to get a suitcase of his essentials and stepped back into the place. He didn't waste time on familiarizing himself with the hosts or the other overnight stayers, nor did he care about his surroundings or the food and drink the Flying Shoe had to offer. Paul just quickly asked whether there was a room on the bottommost floor available and inquired about what he had to pay for the night. He then went to his assigned room. He put his luggage to one side, quickly changed his clothes, and searched through his bag of toiletries for his toothbrush. When he found it, Paul went over to the bathroom, pulled the light switch, and began brushing his teeth in front of the sink. He didn't look in the mirror. He didn't want to. He knew what he would see, and he was terrified of it. Paul sighed and slipped his glasses off and folded them up, putting one of the arms in the collar of his t-shirt so that they hung there, and washed his face with cold water slowly. He sighed and looked up, staring into the mirror, and gulped. For a moment, the mirror showed nothing but the reflection of everything that was behind him. Paul Miller didn't exist in the mirror. Then a figure flitted across it and made Paul jump. Always did. He swallowed thickly as the image shifted, the bathroom changing and shifting back to a time long ago. A smell filled his nostrils, a putrid rank stench that made his eyes water. He didn't know how he knew, but Paul knew it was the Thames. There was a face in the mirror now, and though his vision was slightly blurred, Paul knew it wasn't his own. Where there should have been blue eyes and short ginger hair cropped to the scalp, there were intense grey eyes and shoulder-length black hair pulled back in a ponytail. The different face in the mirror was about his age, but could have passed for much older. The lines in his brows and forehead were deep and prominent, ingrained with the kind of dirt that never washed off. It was an untrustworthy face, a face you wouldn't trust as far as you could throw it. They wore the same clothes, however, and the face made all the expressions Paul did. "You heeded my warning." A cold, deep voice in Paul's head rasped, the reflection's lips unmoving. "Good, very good." The voice was an oxymoron to the reflection in the mirror, silky smooth, even in this torn whisper, and with a pleasant lilt that could make you listen to it all day, all night, forever. But not Paul. He wanted the voice to stop, never wanted to hear it again. "Why won't you leave me alone?" Paul yelped, frozen in place, unable to move away from the image, unable to glance past the clear sign of his broken sanity. He watched with horror and fascination as the reflection mirrored its lips with his words, and his fear reflected in its eyes. "I will, as soon as you do as I ask. The room you're in. There's a tunnel that will lead you to an adjacent dwelling. Find it. You'll get some answers there. I promise you." The image of the other man remained, but the voice went silent. Paul tore his gaze from the mirror, his whole body shaking with fright as he did. He looked around the bathroom. "I'm being ridiculous," he told himself. But then he looked back at the mirror, the different face copying him as he did so. He continued to look for the tunnel the voice had mentioned. At first, Paul was looking for a trapdoor, testing the white and black tiles to see if they were loose. Perhaps the tunnel had been sealed. No, he refused to believe that. He looked above and saw a small hatch in the wall next to him, placed just below the ceiling. That had to be it. Paul got a chair from the bedroom. He clambered on top of it and opened the hatch. He looked inside, finding it dark and lined with cobwebs, the smell of damp, rotting wood overwhelming him and making him gag. And small. God, the tunnel was small. Paul took his glasses and slipped them securely into a buttoned pocket, mumbling to himself. Think happy thoughts, just think happy thoughts. He sucked in his stomach and climbed into the hatch carefully, dragging himself along the tight space with his arms, the wooden frames holding the tunnel up soft to his touch as he went. He took short breaths, hoping against all hope that he wasn't breathing in any spores, and tried to disperse the thought of getting stuck and dying in the tunnel. He could see no light or opening at the end. "Just keep going, Paul," he sang awkwardly to himself. "Just keep going, going, going. What do we do? What? Ah!" He screamed as something scuttled along his arm. He panicked and banged his head on the roof. "Ow!" he moaned, unable to rub his throbbing head. Something climbed into his face, and he closed his eyes and whimpered. He crawled even faster through the space, keeping his head down so that any cobwebs got caught in his hair rather than on his face, with the intent of climbing out the other side as quickly as possible. He didn't feel the space widen a bit, nor did he see an exit still. He mumbled something in the dark. He waited for a guiding voice, something to encourage him, to help him move along. None came. He was sure the spider, or whatever insect it was that crawled on him, had gone beneath his clothes by now. But he was determined not to die in the tunnel, and so he kept going and going and going. If only it wasn't so very, very dark. Chapter 2. It was so dark. You didn't know what darkness was until you were on the inside of a chimney. The space crushing your body, ash and soot filling your lungs, the sky above a speck in the far distance. All the time you'd be hoping to reach that speck of light, just like a moth hoping to reach the distant moon. It was darkness in mind and body, in sight and sound. Darkness that could twist your soul and forge it into a thing blackened and broken. Dark. He had known children to die in those chimneys. They would get stuck, and they'd scream and cry and howl and whimper, and scream and cry and howl and whimper all over again, but no one would hear them. And then they would die. And after that, nothing. Foliage for the next poor, spindly little chimney sweep to clear out. But he was one of the lucky ones. He turned dark quickly, left honest work to dead men and dying children, and became something else. Something not quite right, not quite good, something wrong. His name was Benjamin Robertson. Not that it meant anything to him. The only thing that meant anything to Ben was price. You could put a price on everything. Jewels, reputation, secrets, even trust to a certain extent. He did have but one weakness, however, one you'd have heard of far too many times. But he was getting distracted in the dark, caught up in his dark thoughts. Ben worked furiously on the lock, knowing that the watch would appear soon if someone caught sight of him. He tried his best to pick it, and he would have succeeded were it not for the panic of his annoying peer pacing about the floor, muttering over and over as to how they would all get caught and hanged for it. "Are you done yet?" he snapped in a low voice. Frustrated, Ben sighed through his teeth, twisting the picklock one final time. Success at last. He turned the knob and opened the door. His friend rushed in first. "About bloody time," he hissed. Ben rolled his eyes and followed, closing the door behind him. It could have been a cleaner job. He could have opened the lock without completely destroying it, but a thief's impatience could easily trump his finesse. The room was still and cold, as if the locked door had kept out London's bad weather and the awful smell of the Thames. It was all brick and stone, no fancy wallpaper or paint covering the walls. A few wooden pillars held the ceiling up, the beams on top masterfully placed, thus stopping the ceiling from falling in. The place was a storeroom, scattered with wooden boxes, crates, and barrels. Ben and his mates could live here for a year or so, if whoever owned this place let it be. "Are you sure it's here, Jim?" Ben said, walking up to his fellow thief, crouching by a stack of wooden boxes. Jim pressed a finger to his lips. "Shh," he hissed angrily. "Stop talking, you'll get us both thrown in jail." Ben gave him a look, but held back a retort. Jim was new to the mob. It was only natural that he'd be this way. It didn't make him any less insufferable. "Look there," Jim whispered. A hatch opened above, and two men came down a set of stone steps into the room, chattering amongst each other. Between them they carried a large, heavy wooden chest, and they placed it carefully on the ground. While they spoke and looked idly through the other crates and barrels, Ben gazed at the chest greedily, all the valuables within. It almost made his mouth water and his stomach rumble. He laughed silently at the thought. Since turning to theft, his chin was clean from wishful dribble, and his stomach barely made a sound. But then he frowned, observing the two armed men. "I see metal," he murmured to Jim. "Thieves and swords do not get on well." "Should we leave?" Jim said, barely audible out of fear, lines of worrying appearing in his forehead. "Should we stay? We could wait. Or maybe we should go, get some of the others, but if we leave..." "Clamp your muzzle, man," Ben snapped through his teeth, "and pull yourself together, they'll hear us." Jim paled. "What do we do?" Ben took another look at the guards, and then at the stack of boxes. "I'll lead them away, distract them. When they go, you get that chest open, grab what you can carry and get out. We'll split the loot later. Meet me by the shoe, will you?" Jim nodded, looking relieved that he wouldn't be playing bait, and watched as Ben pulled the black scarf around his neck, up and over his nose so that his fiendishly handsome face was hidden. Ben bent down, shuffling away from Jim, his well-trained feet covered by thin leathers that made no sound as he moved. Ben watched the guards with intent, took in snatches of their meaningless conversation, and slipped a small club out of his belt. Ben didn't like hurting people, but it wasn't beneath him if it meant escaping the gallows. He whistled, just to give fair warning. The guards froze and stiffened, looking around them. Then Ben used his shoulder to tip over a stack of boxes and darted for the exit without looking back. "Thief!" one guard cried. "After him!" yelled the other. Ben ran through the streets, weaving through the pack of bodies as he did so. He heard the draw of steel and the click of triggers, as well as the chaos and panic of people all around him as he rushed past them. The drizzle of rain pitter-pattered on his face and dampened his hair, sending a strange shiver of pleasure through him as he fled from his pursuers. He smiled beneath his veil. Chaos was a friend to the fleeing. The guards got caught by the panicking mass of people and slip-slided on the rain-soaked floor. Ben ducked under a vacant stall and pushed past an assault of old clothes hanging on lines, rushing through the back streets of a squalid London. He came to a crossroad, looked left and right only briefly before knowing exactly where to go. He sped that way and opened a door. The naked woman inside screamed, using whatever she could find to cover herself, but Ben ignored her and rushed to the window, prizing it open, climbing out and up the wall. Guns fired and bullets zipped past him. It wasn't a big deal. Besides, any bullets that hit him now would just be lucky shots. The aim on those guns was greatly off. He got on top of the roof and looked out below, seeing the heavy-clad guards scowling up at him. The climb far too arduous and physically exerting. What he did next wasn't a thing of malice, but a thing of self-pride. He split open his pants and pissed on them. Then he ran and leapt, laughing at the shouts and curses they howled in his direction, and ran across the rooftops until the gunshots were scarce and far off, and no one cried thief. He looked back on his trail, pulling down his scarf and squatting down on a rooftop. The Thieves' Highway. It had earned its name. Ben smiled to himself. He looked up at the sky, heavy with clouds of the deepest grey, the rain falling harder now. Ben knew that if he ever lost his way, he would only have to follow the clouds to find home again. He panted and relished the feel of the heavenly water splashing on his face. Jolly old London. Thief London. Ben rested a while longer before pulling his scarf around his chin up, clambering down to meet Jim at the Flying Shoe. Chapter 3. Paul emerged from the tunnel, reaching for a dim light before falling through the exit. He landed with a soft oomph and held his side. He ignored it. For a moment, he felt so proud of himself. He had conquered a filthy, cobweb and spore-infested tunnel and would live to tell the tale, whilst reliving the vision of Benjamin Robertson running for his life from speeding bullets and flashing swords. The smile on Paul's lips threatened to break his face in two, even though his hip ached from the rough landing. Paul versus tunnel and insanity. 1-0. But then, Paul looked around the tunnel. The upturned corners of his mouth flipped all the way down, and his shoulders sagged. "You have got to be kidding me," he muttered, exasperated as he realized that what he had dropped into was not the room that the voice in his head had been talking about. Instead, it was an interval in the tunnel. There was another hole in the opposing wall, another creepy, disgusting, filthy, claustrophobia-prodding tunnel. "Adjacent room, my behind," Paul said bitterly, kicking a stray pebble before he sat down. He sighed and rubbed his sweaty forehead with the back of his hand. His clothes were grimy and, oddly enough, sooty, and he smelt vaguely of damp and rat piss. Paul took his glasses from his pocket and slipped them on. He blinked. "Wow!" he gasped, as he realized that he was in a cavern. The cavern's walls were lined with gigantic, twinkling stones of varying colours. It was impossible. There was no way that Britain could harbour anything like it, and certainly not in the excruciating long wall of a pub called the Flying Shoe, of all places. He refused to believe it. And what Paul Miller didn't believe, he didn't trust. The stones made him curious, however. Although he vowed not to touch any, he peered into one, hoping to see his reflection. But hope was a sad thing. Again he saw nothing but a flicker before his reflection turned into something else. It showed a very lavish bedroom, one that might belong to a rich lord or lady, or a businessman in some bygone era. Paul stood there, mirrored in stone, wearing his grubby postmodern clothes, yet with that other face, and not his own. Ben's face, he realized. "You should rest," said Ben's voice in Paul's head. You were right not to touch those stones. Some of us were not so cautious. Who are you? Paul asked, remaining calm. Why are you doing this to me? To my family? You will learn, Paul, said the voice. In time, you will learn. Rest for now, and then continue through the tunnel. What will I eat? The voice snorted and scoffed. A single night of hunger will not kill you. Paul furrowed his brows crossly. Do you want me to find this room or not? Do you want to break your family curse or not? Ben countered. I don't believe in curses. I don't believe you have a choice. Of course I have a choice. Fear has robbed you of one. No, I don't believe in curses. Then feel free to leave. Paul looked back at the way he came and hesitated. Well, I've come this far, he said. No response came. Paul sighed. Paul versus Benjamin, 0-1. Paul dragged his feet as he placed himself in a comfortable nook, well away from the tempting glimmer of precious stones, resting his head against the hard, cold stone walls. He was about to put his glasses away when he spied something caught on a jagged stone. Paul bent forward and picked at it. It was a torn piece of fabric. He held the swatch between finger and thumb, examining it. It had an expensive velvety quality and smelled of something wrong, yet still something human. Not blood, not sweat, but something in between. Chapter 4. The Flying Shoe used to be a lively place. The Thames being a flowing mound of human waste, drinking water was practically suicide. The last thing people needed, among poverty, public punishments and hangings, was a disease as humiliating as cholera. So, naturally, people turned to something healthier, something that was used to disinfect wounds. They turned to drink. Both those who could and those who could barely afford it threw what coins they had at alehouses and taverns. Amongst the people who could definitely afford a decent pint were people who stole, just so they could. And thieves like these, thieves like Ben, they stayed well hidden. They stayed out of sight of the dying populace of impoverished, honest men. There was a room on the bottom floor of the Flying Shoe that had a secret passage to another room where Ben and some of his partners in crime liked to gather and revel. Ben felt depressed. It was a few days after he and Jim had performed that area dive. The loot was substantially meagre, even more so when it had been split up. But Ben let it go. He just reminded himself never to pair up with Jim ever again. It was a Wednesday. Worst and best day of the week, Ben liked to call it. There was the faint smell of vomit in the air and of stale beer that had dripped onto the floor never to be cleaned up. The room was quite bare, with plain wooden floors and no plaster on the brick walls. Ben sighed, picked up his mug from the low, stained table and drank from it. It wouldn't do. It wasn't enough to drown his memory of the day in drink. He needed something more. "Oi, Bobbyson," said a thief sitting across from him. "I'm talking to you, mate. You all right?" Ben looked up at him, blinking his eyes heavily to give off the impression that he was tired. He wasn't, of course. Getting any sleep tonight would take a miracle, no less. He said. "Sorry, what were you on about, Ed?" Another thief, sitting in an undignified fashion in the corner of the room, snorted loudly. "Dreaming about his dolly mop, I reckon," she said, her cheeks and nose splashed with red. "His whore!" Her name was Ann Miller. She and Ben had had something of a relationship before Ben had decided he was bored shitless and fed up with her. Ann was all about planning gambits and cutting throats, never in for a dab. They really weren't suited for each other, and they both knew it. Still, Ann remained sore from the relationship's deterioration. "Wouldn't surprise me none," laughed Ed. "What were you saying, Ed?" Ben repeated, ignoring their jibes. "Well, word has it that the Don's asking for you and some of the others," Ed explained. "Are you game?" "I wouldn't trust that fancy gobshite with a toenail clipping if it meant my life," Ann blurted out. "The Don's trouble, Ben. You'd do well to know it. Steals for the fun of it and that." "How much is he paying?" Ben asked simply. Ann rolled her eyes and turned away, but Ed replied, "A fine lot from what I've heard. I say you ought to see what the fuss is about." What time and where? At midnight, the Don's house. Know where it is? Well enough, Ben said, standing up. Do me a favour, will you? What kind of favour? Send little Eric to Dez's window before midnight tonight, Ben said. Might be a bit late, but I should be able to make it to the Don's meeting in time. What? You going to Dez's place now? Anne laughed in her corner. Getting a quick lay before work? Gonna put out the old Nebuchadnezzar on Miss Laycock? Ed raised his brows. She drunk or what? He said with a slight scoff. Anne? Well wasted. Ben replied, cracking a small, amused smile. Ain't happy with me neither, because of Des. Don't tup her, eh? Why? She ain't hitched to you, she's fair game. Ben wanted to say that she was his reserve, but that sounded far too crude to state out loud, so he just mumbled, "You might catch something," and walked up to the small tunnel knocked into the wall just below the ceiling. He climbed up into it and out the other end, walking past the thief romancing a woman he'd found himself for the night, a hand on her chest. It might have bothered him seeing something like that once upon a time, but not anymore. If things like that bothered Ben, he'd never get anything done. He pulled his scarf up over his nose and exited the guest room, pushing past the hustle and bustle of the flying shoe and departing. Chapter 5. The mistress of a thief was referred to in London as a molisher. Desdemona Rosalind Faulkner was technically Ben's molisher, but she was different. Girls like her were doomed to spinsterhood for the simple fact that their fathers were abjectly greedy. Des was the daughter of a recently wealthy middle-class businessman, aspiring to reach the upper stairs on the societal ladder, and he refused to hand that carefully accumulated wealth to some other man when he died, simply because that other man was married to his daughter. Thus, Des's father had two choices: have a son to continue the business, or leave it to his daughter. At the time, his first choice had yet to be fulfilled, and it was beginning to worry the old man. Circumstances had a disconcerting, confusing effect on Desdemona, especially as she watched her friends getting married off one by one. Despite all common sense, alone she sat in her father's house, withering her way into spinsterhood. So how did someone with a name as pompous as Desdemona Rosalind Faulkner end up with Benjamin Robertson, a sketchy character from the London underworld? Funny story that was. Ben had stolen something from her. A fogle, to be specific, a silken handkerchief. And, as unwomanly as it might have been, she chased after him for it. Ben got away, but he later found out that Des had been severely injured after chasing him through the crowded London streets. A broken leg caused by a collision with a cart horse. Run that hard for a fogle? It had to mean something to her. Ben felt uncharacteristically bad about it, and since the fogle had no value to him, he returned Des's fogle to her that same night through her bedroom window. They immediately shunned each other. Then they talked, then they laughed, and eventually became friends of a kind. And now? Ben didn't know what they were now. Those of his ilk would call her a molisher all right, because that's what she was to them. Some might even call her a Judy or a Dollymop, a girl of the streets. But Ben couldn't help feel as though he was the, molisher in this scenario. Des could never marry him. Her father would die just hearing it. Besides, she didn't really love him. She just found him interesting and entertaining. Ben shrugged the thought off as he made his way towards the Faulkner estate, crouching behind the wall and observing the hired guards around the area. It didn't matter. It wasn't important. He was bedding a rich businessman's daughter. And more than that one time. How many thieves could say that? Ben clambered over the stone wall carefully, snuck past the half-snoozing guards as he made his way to the correct face of the house. It was a beautiful estate, with white brick walls, pretty green vines climbing up towards a rusty, red-tiled roof. He found it and looked around him, checking to see if someone was coming his way, then began to climb the wall all the way up to Des's window. He knocked on the glass lightly, hoping that she heard it and that no one was on duty looking up. The curtains parted, and she smiled brightly at him before pulling open the window and letting him slip inside. She was beautiful, far more comely than Anne, but great stress had given her a look of fatigue. Her eyelids drooped heavily, and her smile, though often sincere, was weak. Still, her long auburn hair and large, seductive eyes were enough to draw attention to her. She was wearing an off-white nightgown, nothing else. Her calves and feet were bare, as were her forearms. She wore no jewellery and her hair was undone, fanned out to complement her face. "Ben!" she exclaimed happily. "It's been a while since we last met." Ben accepted her warm embrace. "It has," he said, kissing her hair. "I'm sorry about that. Lots of nests in London to raid, love." Des giggled tunefully and kissed him softly. "By God, you stink! I should have a bath run for you." She raised a brow suggestively. Ben hesitated. "Des." "Oh, come now," she said, teasing and pulling at the buttons on his shirt. "Not bashful, are you?" Ben paused, then took her hands in his. "I need to talk to you." There was a moment of silence before Des broke out into hysterics. "Holy Mother of God, you're leaving me, aren't you?" she said, holding her face. "I knew this day would come. I knew you'd walk out on me. Who is she, Ben?" she wailed. "Who dares to take you from me? I'll match her, I swear I'll—" "Shh," Ben said, taking her shoulders and holding back laughter. "Christ, Des, I'm not leaving you. Now stop that before you wake your father, your mother, and all your other ancestors." Desdemona stopped abruptly. "Oh." Ben smiled and then rubbed the back of his neck. I came to talk. And then?" "We'll see," he chuckled. And then in a more nervous tone he said, "I'm quite disturbed tonight." He was, and Des could probably see it. She paused thoughtfully and smiled at him with reassurance before she sat down on her bed, smoothing out her nightgown. Ben stripped off his jacket, his shoes and his heavy belt, and went up to her, lying down and resting his head on her lap. Des undid the tie in his dark hair and stroked it back gently. Ben closed his eyes contentedly. Anne was never good at this, he thought. "What's troubling you then?" Des asked him. He paused a moment, allowing himself to sink deeper into her calming touch, before speaking the words that made reality a hard thing to live with. "I saw a child die today." Des raised a brow but didn't say anything, waiting for Ben to continue. "He wouldn't reach to my shoulders, tiny as he was," Ben said. "And so thin and bent, you could see his bones through his soaked clothes in the rain. Never seen a clean face in the mirror. Never heard his mother sing him to sleep. Never had a decent father to rely on. And I watched him die, Des," Ben mused, sadness tainting his words. "I watched a hangman put a black sack around the boy's tiny head and a thick noose around his scrawny neck, and then drop him." Ben sighed mournfully and shut his eyes tight. "The way he kicked out, Des, that could so easily have been me a few years back. It could have been me today or next Wednesday or the next." He took a shaky breath before saying, "Poor little Tula, just doing what he needed to get a decent morsel in his belly. I'm never going to forget that." "It's not on you, Ben," Des said softly. "There wasn't anything you could have done." "I wish I could have. I wish I did. You would have just been strung up like the boy. You don't understand, Des. The way his body just hung there limp and swaying. It was like 1 minute there was all this colour, all this vigour and energy to him, and then nothing. Just like that." Did you know him?" "I might have. I couldn't put a name to the poor Chevy's face, but I've probably seen him before. Us thieves, we're family people, brothers to each other." Ben paused. "And I feel like I betrayed him." "What were you doing there anyway?" "Every Wednesday there's a hanging. Most of the time there's quite a few. With all those people, toolers make a decent keep by picking pockets." "You were there to steal?" Des asked with a slight gasp. "From people who wanted to entertain themselves by watching other people die," Ben countered, his face darkening. "I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to be insensitive," Des said quickly. "I'm sorry, Ben, for what you had to see. I can't imagine what it's like to see that happen, to feel the way you do." "Thank you." Des smiled down at him, her neckline dipping so that he could see her cleavage. "Did you come to see if I could make you feel better, Ben?" "Maybe." "Is that a challenge?" Ben sat up and looked at her. "You know it is." Des laughed, putting her arms around his shoulders and kissing him. He responded to her, her thin frame materializing beneath her loose gown. When they let go, she looked into his eyes. "I've missed you, do you know that?" He gave her a look. "You don't mean that, Des." Des's face blanched. "Of course I do," she said. He didn't believe her and so said nothing. "You must know I do," she insisted, hurt by his silence. "Why would you ever think otherwise?" "Because you're a gentleman's daughter, Des," he said almost resentfully. "And I'm the kind of person people want dead." "I don't want you dead." "Because I'm a nice pastime." Des gasped in disbelief. "How could you say that?" "Des, I won't hear any more of this. I love you, Benjamin Robertson. Maybe I didn't at first, but I do now. And don't you dare try to convince yourself that I don't, because I do." Ben stared at her for a while. "But you can't." "But I do," Des said in a softer tone. Ben shook his head. "We can never be together in this world, Des. We'll make something of it." "No, there is no way." "We can elope," Des suggested. "We'll marry." "Oh, yeah. A sound idea," Ben laughed sardonically. "You can come live in my den and eat what scraps and pigskins I can bring home." "I don't care about any of that, Ben." Des took his hand. "I mean it. Do not take my affections lightly." Ben closed his eyes and shook his head slowly, an ironic smile on his face. "I don't. It's just very, very, very hard to believe." "An argument for another time, perhaps?" she asked, leaning closer to him. "Please," he replied. "Now how about that bath?" "Oh, we'd need to undress before we get to that." They never got to get to it. When a sharp knock came at the window, Des yelped and pulled down her gown to hide her knickers before seeing who was there. A spindly child was waiting on the ledge of the open window. "What is this about?" she asked, cross and flustered, blushing furiously. Ben got up and put a hand on Des's shoulder. "Hey-o, Eric," he said to the boy. "Mr. Ben," Eric replied. "Mr. Edward told me to come here for you." Des looked sharply at Ben. "You're leaving now?" Ben hesitated and then looked to Des. I have a meeting to attend. I didn't think the time would fly so fast." Des folded her arms and looked at him incredulously. "You only came here for a quick kip." "Well, when you say it like that." Des threw her head back in disbelief and derision before turning away. "Des." "Just go, Ben," she snapped. Ben stood there indecisively for a moment, but then rubbed back his hair, took his things and turned to the window, following Eric down the wall and out of the Faulkner's territory. Ben sighed sadly and then looked at Eric's face. "You all right, Chavy?" he asked, stopping and taking the boy's chin in one hand to look at the small bruises on his face. "Mr. Edward doesn't like being talked back to," Eric murmured, looking at it. Ben paused. "Bloody Pillock's temper will get him killed one day." He shook his head. "He'll get a good talking to, Eric, I'll make sure of it." For now, though, Ben touched the pouch on his belt and took out a few coins before handing them to Eric. "Thank you for coming to get me. Take this and go buy yourself a decent feed, eh?" Eric smiled a little. "Thank you, Mr. Ben." "Take care of yourself, Chavy," Ben said, setting off for the Don's house. Chapter 6. Paul saw the light at the end of the tunnel at last. After he had woken from the sound dream of Ben Robertson's romantic interest, feeling slightly disappointed that the dream ended before the romance turned into more, he had made himself climb back into the tunnel to continue his arduous journey. And now, crawling through the tiny space on his arms and knees, dust clouding his vision, he could see the end. He could feel the curse slipping away from him. He could soon, oh so soon, put all this nonsensical, insane twaddle behind him. He could go back to his old, cynical life. Then, something went wrong. A sound like a shriek from a microphone screamed in Paul's ears and made him cry out in pain. A cold wind blew from the exit, and the pit of Paul's stomach froze. A weight fell on his neck. An invisible, impossible weight, such that his face fell flat on the floor of the tunnel. "Oh God," he whispered, his breathing suddenly becoming heavy and stunted like there was some unfathomable pressure on his throat. "Oh God, oh Christ, Jesus, Allah, Jehovah, Ahura, Satan, Buddha, anybody," he bellowed desperately, praying for the power to raise his head. "Ben," he called. "Ben, where the hell have you got to? Help me." That cold, smooth voice chuckled in Paul's mind. "You accept my existence now." Paul gasped for breath. "What's going on?" he whimpered. "Don't you know? You have a time limit, Paul." Ben laughed slightly. "And you should have trusted your instincts, ridiculous though they might be." "What are you talking about?" Paul crawled forward, feeling an invisible tether pull at his neck as he did. "The curse, Paul, is on all the men of your family. Our family. But it isn't activated until you enter this tunnel," Ben explained. "So," Paul gasped and gulped for breath, "you tricked me." "If you had left me talking to your mind, my voice would have faded after your 25th birthday. I would have left you alone. But like all your other male ancestors, you came here, to me and my tunnel. Those who went back went insane. Those who soldiered on died. The same death, mind you, just made to appear different to the living." "Why are you doing this?" Paul whined in a frustrated manner. Paul could almost feel Ben smile. "You should never trust a thief." Paul swore loudly, profoundly, for quite some time. Then he sighed and carried forward. He refused to believe that someone like him could die in a disgusting tunnel, smelling and looking the way he did. He grunted, carrying the weight of the invisible noose with him. He would be celebrated after this. He would be the modern Hercules. "Shit!" Paul barked when he scraped his arm across a sharp stone poking out of the tunnel. He stopped to look at the bleeding, painful wound. It would leave a mark. He muttered curses under his breath and then said, "There had better be a golden apple of immortality waiting for me at the end of this." He pushed himself forward, finally poking his head out of the tunnel, but didn't drop down before he tore off one of his sleeves and used it as a bandage for the wound. Then he carefully climbed down and put on his spectacles. Paul looked around and shivered. It was the secret room the hosts of the Flying Shoe kept for thieves. Only, the regulars were very dead. The room stank of years of decay, the fond fungal spores filling Paul's sinuses. He covered his nose with the neckline of his shirt. Paul remembered Anne sitting in the corner, sleeping but alive. He remembered Edward sitting at the low table, drinking from a metal flagon. They were still here, yet moving in frozen silence. Edward's skeletal form was drinking from the age-old flagon, throwing the dried-out drink down his decomposed throat. Anne's skeletal figure leaned in the corner, her legs splayed out, her fleshless skull swaying in drunken lethargy. The teeth smiled involuntarily, but mockingly. Anne Miller. Paul Miller. Paul grasped the wall for support. "The bastard," Paul murmured. Ben had said the curse permeated his family. Our family. Paul gulped down a mixture of emotions and stepped towards Anne. Her head stopped swaying, as if to examine her accidental descendant with eyeless sockets, and then burst into audible laughter, her jaw chattering up and down. The Edward skeleton also started laughing. "He ain't got a chance," Anne shrieked. "No chance at all," Edward agreed, their voices ethereal and echoing. Dead voices, like whispers amplified in sound. Then they laughed and laughed and laughed. Paul fell on his knees, covering his ears to block out the sound, but it filled his mind and stabbed at all his senses, jittering his bones and splintering his flesh. He screamed to cover the sound. It didn't work, and all the while, the invisible noose tugged at his throat constantly, getting minutely tighter and tighter by the second. Chapter 7. Anne was right about the Don. Mr. Timothy Huntington was a rich troublemaker, a gentleman thief. He was a man who stole, not out of malice, but for the thrill of stealing. In other words, he had absolutely no excuse for it. And, out of all types of thieves, his kind especially could not be trusted. Yet, Ben attended the meeting Ed spoke of anyway. What could he say? If it meant money, it meant money. And if Des's sentiments were true, which Ben still highly doubted, he would need a whole bloody lot of it. Mr. Huntington's house was similar to the Faulkner estate, but slightly more squat and longer to one side. Ben entered with caution, avoiding the guards posted around the area, going into the building through the servants' entrance that conveniently had been left open. Ben found no servants within, so he went through the room, looking through apron pockets, taking what he could find. He stepped into the kitchen, quickly assessing the charred oven, the impressive rack of knives, and the black and white tiled floors. Ben considered taking a few knives for a second. They could be pawned off for quite the price. But he didn't have anything to wrap them in. Stealing them was hardly worth getting stabbed for. Instead, he picked up leftovers from the unclean countertops and ate them. Then Ben heard voices coming from the dining room and paused by the slightly open door. Some of the voices he recognized, so he nodded to himself and stepped in. Of all the people he expected to see seated at the Don's table, he had not expected Ed and Anne. Typical. Mr. Huntington stopped mid-sentence and smiled warmly at Ben, too warmly for it to be sincere. "Ah, Mr. Robertson, welcome," he cried. "Come, take a seat. We've been expecting you for some time now." Mr. Huntington was a man with prominent sideburns, fair-faced, tinted with a comely blush, his brown hair combed to one side. He wore a dark brown jacket, a green shirt beneath, and a white necktie. His worst feature was his nose, which stuck out like a beak. He was very relaxed in the company of thieves, it turned out, smiling freely, leaning back in his seat. Mr. Huntington knew that he held the upper hand. Ben knew that a man like Huntington could betray them and have all of them arrested and hanged. He also knew that the man would have absolutely no trouble sleeping thereafter. Ben narrowed his eyes, not buying the Don's easy and pleasant charm at all. He went to sit near Anne. "I thought you hated the idea of working with the Don," he muttered to her quietly. "And?" Anne squawked irritably, clearly still drunk from before. "I do a lot of things I don't like, you being one of them. How's your dolly mop, by the way? She enjoy your nightly exploit to her bedchambers?" Ben sighed. All right, pipe down, you've made your point." Mr. Huntington stood up, completely ignoring the disturbance, and spread his arms welcomingly. "Now that we're all gathered, I shall waste no time in explaining a rather strange piece of news that has reached me," he said, pausing for effect. "Back when good Queen Elizabeth reigned, her favoured captain, Sir Francis Drake, stole many goods from the Spanish treasure fleets, sailing from what was known at that time as the New World. Some of these treasures were chartered, others were not," he smiled fiendishly. "Now, I heard a rumour that some of Sir Francis's unmentioned treasure is being dumped in the Thames. For what reason, I am unsure, but we cannot let this opportunity slip through our fingers. Ladies and gentlemen, Spanish treasure, it could be ancient. And what is ancient is worth a fortune." The thieves looked at each other, raising their brows with uncertainty. "There must be a reason why it's being tipped in the Thames," said one of them. "Nobody would just throw that away." "Probably some jealous, petty fools heating their grudges," Mr. Huntington agreed, shrugging his shoulders. "Though, if some of you do not seek any part in this, for the fear of revenge, you're free to leave." No one moved for a moment. Then, the thief who questioned the treasure rose, drained his glass and said, "Better safe than sorry, lads. Too many strange things in the world to take chances." He left without another word. There was a silence for a moment. The thief had a point. There were too many strange things in the world to take chances, but from where Ben and the others were sitting, there were even more hungry mouths to be fed, their own being their priority. Ben didn't claim to be a hero, but theft was his livelihood. The other thieves were the closest thing he had to a family. They had a right over him, and he had a responsibility to them. And then there was Des. For Ben, there was no second-guessing the matter. "So," Ben said, "what's the plan?" Chapter 8. Ever smelled the Thames, the terminus of London's sewers? If you fell in, there was a good chance you would come out a corpse. The horrid, putrid stench could fill every sense, drive you insane. You would smell it, feel it burn in your eyes. It would make your body itch with disgust. You would taste it on the tip of your tongue, and it would make you gag. Ben tried his best to ignore the smell, covering his face with a scarf. He was waiting by the pier behind a stack of boxes with Ed and Mr. Huntington at his side. Anne and some of the others were waiting some way off. They were all expecting a convoy. Mr. Huntington had informed them that a squad of men would come and simply dump the chest into the river. The plan was to attack the men and take the treasure before any of them could call for help. They were to meet back at Mr. Huntington's compound, where Huntington would keep possession of the chest, then paying each thief their share of the loot from his own wealth. Ben took a peek, becoming impatient. He shivered in the dark, blowing into his palms and rubbing them together to cause some warmth. He shifted his position slightly, trying to wake his legs and shake off the pins and needles. "Do you see anything?" Ed asked quietly. Ben heard a slight disturbance and raised a hand to silence Ed. It was footsteps, maybe belonging to 7 or 8 men, and the clink-clank of weapons or armour or both. Ben took another peek when he saw the flicker of burning torches. It was unclear in the dark, but he thought he made out 7 guards and 1 gentleman in a long coat and breeches. A large chest was being carried between 2 of the guards. The gentleman was speaking, announcing something. Ben took out his club. "Now's the time to strike," he whispered. "But we have to do this carefully." "Oi!" came a shout. "You louts out for a stroll?" Ben shut his eyes and shook his head. Anne, always trying to prove something. "The drunk prig!" Ed muttered furiously. "Well, bloody come on then!" He ran out as the guards pulled out their swords and rifles. Ben jumped out of hiding, running into the thick of escalating combat. He could hear surprised shouts, unaimed gunfire, and the clash of steel. A single howl of pain tore through the night, and smoke added to the acrid smell. Ben managed to catch 1 guard on the back of the head, but he wasn't a fighter. He looked around him, ducking under swipes and avoiding rifle snouts. He saw a thief holding one side of the chest and ran to get the other end. Ben nodded to the thief, and they ran away with the chest. They ran and ran, until they could no longer hear the sound of combat. Ben didn't know what had become of Ed or Anne or even Mr. Huntington, but the ordeal probably hadn't gone well for them. He sighed and sat down in a dirty alleyway, panting. The other thief sat on the chest and looked up at the sky as the rain started to drizzle. "Bloomin' English weather," the thief muttered. Ben said nothing. He just swallowed thickly. "Want to get this open then?" asked the thief. Ben nodded and picked the lock quickly. Their gasps of delight were fast restrained, and immediately the image of their perishing companions were fading from their minds. They both stared down at the glittering mass of wealth. A single item caught and held Ben's attention, and he picked it up gingerly, as if it might snap at his slightest touch. It was a silver necklace, polished to a gleam, inlaid with a single large green stone. He was mesmerized by the necklace. Des would love it. Ben pocketed it quickly. "Oi, oi!" the thief protested. "You saw nothing," Ben cut in aggressively. "Take what you want, I don't give a toss, but you say nothing. We take this to the Dons, nobody loses." The thief regarded him for a moment, before taking a few gold coins, and then they shut the lid of the chest slowly. Ben locked it again as best as he could. It would have to do. Then they picked up the chest. They took to the back streets to make their way to Mr. Huntington's house. Chapter 9. "No!" Des screamed. "Get that thing away from me!" Ben stared at Des, holding the necklace between his palms, wondering what the hell was wrong. What's the matter? Murder! Murder in your hands! Des cried. Stop it, Ben! Stop it! I'm not doing anything, Ben said, putting the necklace in his pocket and reaching down to hold Des. Des, love, calm down. I'm not going to hurt you. She wept, trying to push Ben desperately away. You murderer, she mumbled. You murderer, oh God. Des. Get away from me, she screamed. Chapter 10. Paul awoke to Desdemona's screaming, but he was no longer in the thief's lair. He took short, quick breaths, the coarse, invisible noose tightening around his neck. He sat up uncomfortably and looked around. The room was expensive and posh, with a burning fireplace and green velvet armchair. A bearskin rug covered the wooden floorboards, and a shimmering chandelier hung from above, lighted with at least 20 or 30 candles. Paul huffed, clawing at his neck. Where was he? Hello? He called. Then he heard the slow clip-clop of boots on the floor. You made it then, he heard the familiar voice say. Well done. I'm impressed. Ben's hand ruffled Paul's hair, and he came into view, kneeling down so their faces were level. I honestly didn't think you would make it out of the tunnel. Paul blinked, staring at the face he had seen so many times, but suddenly unable to recognize it. Ben looked so dapper. He was dressed like a gentleman, in a green coat with brass buttons and a silk necktie. He wore dark cotton breeches and knee-length riding boots. He held a tall top hat in his white gloved hands. What's the matter? Noose got your neck? Ben asked. Paul curled his lip. What do I have to do to stop this madness? Stop it? Oh, it's a very simple task, Ben replied. You have to kill a woman. Paul stared at him. How are you even here right now? Ben laughed. Oh, well, that is an odd bit of business, isn't it? Please, just tell me what's going on. Have you not been paying attention to my memories, Paul? Have you not inferred the most obvious of conclusions? I'm short on air. Pity that excuse won't save you. Paul coughed hoarsely and then said, You stole a necklace from Sir Francis Drake's treasure. Correct, Ben said. And you gave the necklace to Desdemona Faulkner. Indeed. And then I got confused. All of the contents of the box, much to your disbelief, Paul, are cursed. That necklace, however, had a special curse. The people Sir Francis robbed from were not kind, and they managed to curse the box before the Spaniards stole it from them. It was still cursed when Drake stole it from the Spaniards. One of his descendants inherited it, and with it the curse, on and on, until Mr. Timothy Huntington stole it. The point of note, however, is that the contents only take effect if they are removed. Essentially, it affects the person who removes them. The necklace was given a lover's curse, so when I handed it to poor Desdemona, a scream emerged from an adjoining room, and then insane yowling and babbling. The woman Paul had learned was Desdemona Faulkner kicked the door open, her elaborate white dress in tatters, her beautiful hair in disarray, her hands clawing at the air. Around her neck was the cursed necklace. Murderer! Murderer! She rasped. Where are you, maggot? I'll sweeten you. I'll tear you down. Ben went up to Desdemona and smoothed her hair down, kissed her cheeks, and murmured a few words in her ear. For a moment, she looked like she'd returned to normal, returned to sanity, and then she looked at Paul. Kill her then, Paul, and you will be removed of the curse. Ben tossed him a knife. Desdemona leapt on Paul as he scuttled out of the way, crawling on his hands and knees as she screamed and barked at him. Her clawed hands found his hair and yanked his head back. Paul choked a howl of pain. You monster, Paul shouted at Ben. You're a monster. Am I? Ben asked, frowning. What would you have chosen? Your lineage or the woman you love? I had no idea I even had offspring, but as it turns out, he raised a hand in Paul's direction. I had some by Anne. Desdemona beat Paul's face with her fists. You could have done anything else, Paul screamed, pushing her away. Anything else, you could have let us go. I'm afraid not, Ben said. The demon attached to the curse demands each of your lives. The way you see Desdemona is the way she is when only the demon inhibited her to kill you. Otherwise, we live quite happily here. Paul huffed and puffed. You're selfish! And why shouldn't I be? Ben demanded. I have only had myself to care for all my life. I don't see why that should change simply because a man who has lived 25 wholesome years must die for it. I couldn't even dream of reaching that age. Paul stood up lethargically, feeling the pressure on his throat. Desdemona flew at him and he slapped her across the face, throwing her into the fireplace. She shrieked in pain. Ah, now you've done it, Ben tutted. He walked out of the room, clearly having seen enough. Paul dived for the knife and held it up as Desdemona rose out of the flames, her hair and dress burning, her face dripping away like melting wax. Paul stared at her, backing away as his insides went cold. She stepped out of the fireplace, her feet igniting the rug, and stomped towards Paul, slowly gasping, "Murderer, murderer." Paul tried to swallow his saliva, but he could feel the invisible, impossible rope at its final strains. It was now or never. He took the deepest breath he could and threw himself at the demon Desdemona, stabbing her face wildly like a madman. She screamed and cried and kicked and writhed, but she would not die. Paul then looked at her necklace, glinting up at him, and slammed the pommel of the knife at the green gemstone. A scream filled his mind, but he continued to smash it. Smoke erupted from the broken stone and almost made a demonic face that tried to snap at him. But it faded to vapor, and the body beneath him went still. "Thank you," was the last thing he heard, a pleasant woman's voice that would linger in his mind for all the years to come, before he passed out. Chapter 11. When Paul awoke, he found himself lying at the edge of the River Thames. He got up and looked down at his clothes, touched his face, and looked at his arms. He was fine. Paul knew it. He knew it. "How much did I drink last night?" he muttered, stuffing his hands in his pockets and walking away. "Voices and demons and curses. What's gotten into you, Paul?" He inquired about the flying shoe to many pedestrians, but no one seemed to know. They all commented on how stupid a name. Suddenly he came upon the lady who had welcomed him in. "Poor dearie," she clucked. "You must have had a bad bump on the head. You're staying at that inn over there." He looked up to where she pointed and found himself looking at an old inn with no sign. And, sure enough, his car was parked outside. Whatever, wasn't unusual at all. He trudged his way up to the inn and let himself in, ignoring the fact that the place was absolutely deserted, and found the room he had booked. Curses, what a load of twaddle. Paul found his suitcase and decided to pack his things and leave immediately. Not that he was scared or anything. With a gnawing sensation digging into his stomach, he peeked into the bathroom just to be sure. He stepped in. No tunnel entrance, no trapdoors, no voices. Paul looked into the mirror. It was his reflection, all right. His nice, pudgy face with the smart glasses and the single dimpled cheek. Yet there was a small, but noticeable addition. Around his neck was a mark only a rope could have made. This is a work of fiction. Names, characters, businesses, places, events, and incidents are either themselves products of the author's imagination, or if such names, characters, businesses, places, events, and incidents actually exist, the actions, views, and/or other characteristics attributed to them are products of the author's imagination. Nothing in this work of fiction should be regarded as inferring that in reality any actual person or entity has acted or would act in a given way, or that they hold or have held given views or characteristics. This work of fiction is not endorsed by the names, persons, brands or businesses featured or referred to in it.